Welcome. My name is Laura Rougham, and in this compilation video, I will showcase some of my favorite paranormal cases that we explored on the Paranormal Scholar in 2019. I invite you to sit back and enjoy. There is something about mirrors that attracts the mind to the paranormal. This notion perhaps extends from an innate incomprehension of how the world can be seen so clearly and exact upon something so flat and two-dimensional. It may be that some primal part of our brain searches for some small mark of difference to distinguish our comfortable three-dimensional reality from that of the two-dimensional mirror. Creators of horror movies and fiction play on the complexity of the mirror all the time, a classic trope being the catching sight of the evil being in the mirror before it strikes in real life. The implication is that there is a sinister aspect to the copycat dimension of the mirror that we casually look at every day. The connection between a sinister other world and mirrors has been around since mirrors were first used millennia ago. One traditional ritual game involved young women walking up a flight of stairs backwards in the dark save for the candle they were carrying. When the girl reached the mirror upstairs, the rules of the ritual game instructed her to gaze into it. Supposedly, a face would appear, the face of her future husband. However, for some unfortunate girls, they would instead catch sight of a skull or the Grim Reaper. If this happened, then it was said that the church bells would ring out for her funeral rather than a wedding. This practice has evolved over time into the ritual game we know today as Bloody Mary. Whether alone or in a group of people, it is said that Bloody Mary appears to those who chant her name 3 or 13 times into a mirror. She is said to take on many forms according to those who have claimed to see her. Sometimes she is covered in blood, sometimes she is a corpse, on other occasions a witch or a ghost. Occasionally Bloody Mary is even benevolent, but those stories are rarer. Usually she is depicted as evil, a being known to scream at the ritual's participants, curse them, steal their souls, or even cause them physical harm. Whilst this may seem like a sensational urban legend, there is a measure of truth in it. In fact, you do not need to chant anything to start seeing manifestations in mirrors. One paranormal practice merely requires an ordinary mirror, a dim light, and a patient participant to gaze into the mirror. One of the more common sights is seeing one's facial features become distorted and even seem like they are melting. In more extreme reports, people have claimed to have seen animals, strange faces, and even ghosts. Giovanni Caputo of the University of Urbino in Italy has stated that this phenomenon occurs due to an inexplicable misfiring of the brain's facial recognition system. Others say that the visions that occur are due to a form of self-hypnosis. In the 1990s, the psychologist and philosopher Dr. Raymond Moody popularized the use of mirrors when he discussed the concept of a psychomantium. A psychomantium is a small enclosed area set up with a comfortable chair, dim lighting, and a mirror angled so as not to reflect anything but darkness. The experiencer then sits in the chair and stares into the darkness. It is said that using a psychomantium may enable communication with the dead. Dr. Moody has expressed that such exercises have helped people manage their grief. After all, there are many reports from people who have used a psychomantium claiming that their dead loved ones have come back to speak to them and give comfort. Yet, not all uses of mirror magic are described as ending so positively, whether it be the appearance of Bloody Mary, or a dark shadow reflected in the mirror for only a split second. The sinister consequences of using mirrors in paranormal rituals are simply too heavy for many to justify using them. Sir Winston Churchill was one of the most remarkable men of the 20th century. He filled many roles in his life: a war correspondent who took part in a cavalry charge, a Boer POW who escaped captivity and lived as a fugitive in South Africa, Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty in the Great War, and later, and most memorably, the heroic Prime Minister who led Great Britain through its finest hour in the 1940s. Churchill was in his 60s when he led his nation against the most terrible war machine ever conceived by mankind. Yet, there was one person who had predicted this with incredible precision: Churchill himself, at the age of 16. It was a summer's evening in 1891, and 16-year-old Churchill and Maryland Evans, a classmate, were talking together in a basement room of their headmaster's house at Harrow School. The young men's conversation turned towards the future. According to Evans, who recalled their conversation in his diary, Churchill stated that he had a wonderful idea of where I shall be eventually. "I have dreams about it," he said. "I see into the future." When asked about his dreams by Evans, young Churchill said that he could see vast changes coming over a now peaceful world. Great upheavals, terrible struggles, wars such as one cannot imagine. As shocking as this statement may seem, 16-year-old Churchill claimed to have seen more. He told Evans that he knew that London will be in danger. London will be attacked, and I shall be very prominent in the defence of London. At the time, Evans' response was one of disbelief. With the dreadful days of the Napoleonic Wars now long ago, he regarded Great Britain as forever safe from invasion. To this comment, Churchill supposedly scoffed, explaining that he could see further ahead than Evans. He restated his belief that their country will be subjected somehow to a tremendous invasion. By what means, I do not know. But I tell you, I shall be in command of the defences of London, and I shall save London and England from disaster. During the conflict of the 1940s, hundreds of thousands of bombs were dropped on Britain, with London experiencing 85 major raids by the time the war ended. Certainly, if ever the capital had faced disaster, it was when Churchill was leading the city's defences. Did Churchill's 1891 dreams reveal where he would be in 1940? Far from being a foreseeable path, his future career was hardly predictable. Churchill had multiple near-death experiences, was disgraced during the Great War, and later politically marginalised. Even when the time came in 1940, it was almost a miracle that he was chosen to lead his country over his rival Lord Halifax, whom many preferred for his conciliatory approach. The circumstances had to be precise for Churchill to have become Prime Minister in those tumultuous times. So how do we explain his supposed foresight? It could, of course, have simply been a great boast from an egocentric teenager. Yet, at the time, Britain was at the apex of its power. Queen Victoria, Empress of India and Grandmother of Europe, sat at the head of an empire that controlled nearly 1/4 of the world's population. It was almost unimaginable that London, the heart of that empire, would be in danger. If one were to boast, it would make more sense to speak of conquering the rest of the world, and finish colouring the globe red for Britain. Churchill did not, however. Rather, he specified London and England, the centre of the most powerful global empire there had ever been, as being one day in his lifetime on the brink of disaster, and that he would lead its defences. Did Sir Winston Churchill really dream of the future at the age of 16? The following footage was shared by the British Earth and Aerial Mystery Society after being filmed by Craig Megson in early February 2018. The video appears to show a formation of unidentified flying objects cross the night sky. Megson was changing trains at Preston train station in Lancashire, England, on his way home after a day out with his 6-year-old son. According to his testimony, it was around 6:30 in the evening when he noticed a series of lights in the sky. At first he thought the objects were planes, yet with no flashing lights or sound, he soon dismissed his initial assumption. Then, when more lights appeared, also moving in silent, steady formation, he knew he was witnessing something extraordinary. The peculiar objects quickly drew a crowd of at least 20 people, all with their eyes turned to the sky. Like Megson, they could not explain what they were seeing. In his own words, "I asked the man next to me what he thought they could be, and he simply said, 'They're not planes, mate, that's for sure.'" One explanation that has been proposed is that the mysterious lights were simply Chinese lanterns. However, Megson has stated that the weather conditions that evening were windy. It is highly unlikely that a group of paper lanterns could have moved in such a steady, evenly spaced formation under such windy conditions. Not only that, Chinese lanterns are highly regulated in the United Kingdom. Local authorities must be notified, and lanterns are not permitted in wind speeds of 5 miles per hour or higher. For Craig Megson, the footage is compelling proof that we are not alone in the universe, validating his belief that UFOs of alien origin have been spotted in the skies above his home county of Lancashire for decades. Whilst it is impossible to conclude that these objects are extraterrestrial, they are unidentified. Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard was a senior commander in the British Royal Air Force in the 1940s. What would be remembered as a distinguished military career began some years earlier in the 1920s, when he read engineering at the University of Cambridge. From there, Goddard became an instructor to the university's air squadron, and later served as a commander for a bomber squadron. In 1935, he was appointed Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Air Ministry. It was at this point that Goddard experienced something that would both haunt and fascinate him for the rest of his life. In his 1975 book, Flight Towards Reality, Goddard recalls a flight he made in 1935 to Edinburgh, Scotland, from Andover, England. As he approached Edinburgh, his plane passed over a dilapidated airfield in Drem, Scotland. From Goddard's observations, the base had clearly been abandoned for some time. Vegetation had overtaken most of the area, and cattle from a nearby farm had moved in. Thinking nothing more of it, Goddard continued his flight until he reached Edinburgh. A few days later, Goddard was due to return to Andover. Following the same flight path as before, he headed in the direction of Drem. However, before he reached the airfield, he flew into bad weather. Goddard described the storm as strange. Along with strong winds and torrential rain, the storm clouds were yellow. Disoriented and quickly losing control of his plane, the experienced pilot climbed the clouds, hoping to burst through into the clear sky. However, they appeared to have no end. It was at this moment that the storm clouds finally broke beneath him, and Goddard was able to see the ground again. Ahead of him was Drem Airfield. Relieved to see a familiar sight, he left the storm behind him and flew into sun and clear skies. Yet, as Goddard got closer, he realized that the Drem Airfield was not so familiar after all. In fact, it was completely different. Far from being reclaimed by the surrounding nature, the Drem Airfield was alive with activity. Not only was it no longer abandoned, it looked pristine. Mechanics were bustling on the ground below, and 4 planes, each painted bright yellow, sat on the runway. Most strange, however, was how Goddard was unable to identify one of the planes. It was a monoplane, unlike any that the Royal Air Force used. In addition to the strangeness of the yellow planes, Goddard was also surprised to see the mechanics dressed in blue overalls. To his knowledge, all RAF mechanics wore brown. Having little time to digest what he was seeing, Goddard passed over the airfield at Drem and flew back into the storm. The clear skies and bright sun were replaced by the same torrential rain and yellow clouds as before. Once again, he struggled to keep control of his aircraft. Eventually, he was able to wrestle free of the tempest and make it back safely to Andover. When he told his friends what he had seen during his flight, he was greeted with skepticism. The airfield at Drem had, after all, been vacated in 1919, and from 1933 had only seen occasional use from visiting squadrons. There was no possibility of there being an active squadron with planes and mechanics at the airfield when Goddard made his flight in 1935. 4 years after Goddard's peculiar experience in 1939, the overgrown airstrip at Drem was resurfaced, and the whole airfield transformed and reactivated, becoming home to the No. 13 Flying Training School. Not only that, the RAF began to paint their training planes yellow, and a new monoplane, the Miles M14 Magister, joined the roster. By that year, even the mechanics' overalls had been updated to blue instead of brown. Goddard's vision had become a reality. After that, Sir Victor Goddard developed a fascination with paranormal phenomena. He was certain that he had visited the future during his flight in 1935. Olaus Magnus was a 16th century Catholic ecclesiast and writer. He was known as a man with a great sense of scientific scrutiny, having created the most accurate map of the Baltic northern regions of the time. However, after the success of the religious reformation in Sweden, Magnus was forced to flee, exiled to Poland and eventually to Italy. There he wrote and in 1555 published his most famous work, the title of which translates into English as a description of the northern peoples. In his text, Magnus details a general phenomenon that occurred in the Baltic regions of northern Europe. As he described it, the inhabitants suffer considerably from the rapacity of wolves throughout the year. However, these numerous and aggressive wolf attacks were not regarded as such a serious matter, for there was something far more destructive and dangerous that northern Europeans had to endure. According to Magnus, far worse than natural wolves were men turned into wolves. Supposedly, it was around Christmas time that a multitude of wolves, transformed from men, gathered together, and then spread to rage with wondrous ferocity against human beings. Far from being at the mercy of ordinary wolves, the ecclesiast stated that villagers could tell the difference between wolfmen and true and natural wolves. The werewolves' behaviour was easily identifiable. According to the text, when a human habitation has been detected by them isolated in the woods, they besiege it with atrocity. They devour all the human beings and every animal which is found within. Magnus wrote how werewolves supposedly congregated at a ruined castle in the thousands, assaulting the fortification by jumping over the walls. He also related the story of a nobleman who supposedly had in his retinue a peasant with the ability to turn into a wolf. Magnus's writings are often dismissed as a series of unsubstantiated accounts based on local superstition. When speaking about his observations, it is more preferable for academics to focus on what they are certain he was correct about, such as his geographical observations. Werewolves, they conclude, couldn't possibly be a reality. And indeed, it could be said that Magnus's descriptions of werewolves gathering together and attacking villages were superstitious rationalizations for bandit attacks during the Christmas period. After all, around Christmas, many labourers found themselves unemployed and often took to drinking and committing crimes. Historically, this has resulted in the holiday season having a mixed reputation, inspiring tales of Krampus and other demonic beings bent on destruction and wrongdoing. Magnus even stated that the so-called werewolves that ravaged the Baltics emptied tons of beer or mead from village cellars. However, as convincing as this explanation may first seem, there is a major flaw. Whilst bandits marauding across the countryside are of course a common occurrence in history, they are not commonly known for devouring human flesh en masse. This is a far more bestial, far darker trait. A trait which is perhaps only reserved for unnatural creatures like werewolves. On the 29th of August 1677, Christoph Haizmann was found on the floor convulsing violently whilst he was working in a small castle in Potterbrunn, Austria. The authorities took him in for questioning, initially believing him to be bewitched and that he himself was possibly a witch. There was a reason for the authorities' paranoia. This was the age of witch hunts. In nearby Salzburg, such inquests were commonplace and would continue to be until 1690, claiming more than 100 lives in the process. Haizmann was initially in very real danger, yet the story that he told the authorities quickly made them reassess the situation. He explained that he was not bewitched, but rather he had made a deal with the devil and was now demonically possessed. Haizmann explained that 9 years ago the devil appeared to him whilst he was an impoverished painter. The devil tempted him repeatedly, hounded him, offering him money, power and women, until finally he succumbed on the 9th temptation. The reason he finally agreed to strike a deal was because the devil promised to cure his depression, which he had suffered since the recent loss of his father. 2 pacts were then supposedly signed between him and the devil, one in ink, the other in blood. Haizmann pledged in those agreements that in return he would give himself, body and soul, to the devil in 9 years' time on the 24th of September. At the time of his arrest, this was only a few weeks away. When the local Catholic priest Leopold Braun heard Haizmann's story, he took pity on him, describing him as a miserable man. The priest wrote to a nearby abbey and asked them to assist him. They, in due course, accepted Haizmann, and the monks there started to perform severe exorcisms. Haizmann was dutifully penitent and did everything they told him. Yet, at midnight on the 8th of September, he met the devil again. The monks attested that, whilst holding him in a state of agony, Haizmann freed himself and ran to their chapel, only to return with a piece of paper some time later. Haizmann claimed that the piece of paper was the contract written in blood many years ago. He said that he had snatched the accursed pact from the very claws of the devil, who appeared to him in the form of a winged dragon. The monastery popularized his case as a miracle. However, it was not to last, for by the 11th of October, Haizmann's convulsions were back. Not only that, they were worse than ever, sometimes leaving him entirely paralyzed. During these episodes, he later testified to being tormented not only by the devil, but by the Virgin Mary and Christ. The devil with his customary temptations, and Christ and Mary demanding he renounce worldly possessions and become a man of God. Again, Haizmann underwent exorcisms, and this time received the pact he had made in ink from the devil. After this, he joined a monastery and became a monk. There, he completed several paintings of the devil in his different incarnations, including an especially grand piece in which he painted the Virgin Mary helping him to retrieve the pact in ink from the devil. The torments, however, never stopped. They would plague Haizmann for the rest of his life until he died in the year 1700, peaceful and of good comfort. Whilst in ancient times witchcraft was viciously pursued if it was thought to have caused intentional harm, Europeans in early modern times persecuted witches on principle. Nowhere is this more evident than in the witchcraft trials that occurred in the Holy Roman Empire, where thousands were tied up and wed to the flames. Rarely was the morality of such violent and widespread persecution of supposed witches questioned. That was until the prosecution of Dorothea Flock in the Bavarian town of Bamberg. Her story was not only incredibly tragic, but symptomatic of everything that was wrong with the witch hunt fever that gripped the times. Dorothea was the second wife of Bamberg's government councillor George Heinrich Flock. George had remarried after overcoming the loss of his first wife, who had been persecuted for being a witch, and met the flames in May 1628. In a cruel twist of fate, his second wife, Dorothea, began to tread the very same path in December 1629. Initially, it was an anonymous accusation of adultery that landed Dorothea in prison. After her arrest, she managed to escape, most likely fearing the unreasonable courts of the time and their seemingly insatiable appetite for persecuting women. Unfortunately, she was caught, only now she was accused of witchcraft. Tragically experienced after the loss of his first wife, George immediately fled to Nuremberg, where he appealed to Dorothea's highly influential family, the Hoffmanns, for help. Together they contacted influential nobles, religious authorities, and even the Infanta of Spain for assistance. These measures helped delay Dorothea's trial and made her imprisonment more comfortable. They could not, however, secure her release. It was not until George went personally to the Aulic Council, one of the supreme courts of the Holy Roman Empire, that he was able to achieve anything substantial. The council mandated that any decision should be delayed until the birth of Dorothea's child, as she was pregnant when she was arrested. Her pregnancy delayed proceedings until 6 weeks after giving birth. Once her body ceased to contain an innocent child, it was roughly given over to the witch hunters. They examined her, and under duress, Dorothea confessed to all allegations. During this time, the Aulic Council had also been busy and had drafted a mandate for her release. Yet, when the mandate arrived in Bamberg, Dorothea's ashes were being gathered from the pyre. The witch hunters, upon hearing that the mandate was on its way, had accelerated Dorothea's execution. Infatuated with what they believed to be a righteous battle against the damnable art of witchcraft, the witch hunters made sure that red-hot pincers and flames were given to Dorothea instead of freedom. After this travesty, a resistance circle was formed in Nuremberg called the Hoffmanns' Friendship, in memoriam of Dorothea's family name, which rallied broad support against the injustices inherent in witchcraft trials. In Greek mythology, the souls of the departed travel to the underworld after death. Sometimes called Hades in reference to its patron god, the underworld is described as a dark, sunless region, located either beneath the greatest depths of the earth or at the outer bounds of the ocean. In order to access the underworld, one must cross the Styx, Hades' most prominent river. The ferryman is the one to take the souls which enter the underworld across the river in exchange for a coin. Those souls who have not received a proper burial and are therefore unable to pay the ferryman are left behind. The Christian equivalent of Hades can be said to be hell, for both are regarded as the dark counterpart to the bright and holy kingdom of the gods. And, just like hell, there have been living souls, not just the dead, who have gone searching for the entrance to the underworld. Someone who may have succeeded in locating an entrance to the underworld is Robert Paget. In the early 1960s, Robert Paget, a British doctor working at a nearby NATO airbase, lived in the ancient Roman town of Baia. Paget was an amateur archaeologist who excavated in his spare time. It was the enigmatic cave of the Sibyl, described by Virgil and other classical authors, which intrigued Paget the most. The cave, according to mythology, was inhabited by a prophetess who made an unfortunate deal with the god Apollo. As a young woman, she had promised her most precious gift to Apollo in exchange for as many years of life as there are particles in a pile of dust. However, as she struck the deal, she made the mistake of not clarifying that those years should come with ageless youth as well. As such, the Sibyl, a Greek term for a prophetess, aged but could not die. For years afterwards, she remained in her cave, a cave which, as well as providing her with a place to divine the future, supposedly concealed an entrance to the underworld. Robert Paget was one of few people who believed that the cave was a real location, and did indeed contain a gateway to Hades. It had long been said that the Phlegrean Fields, located on the north shore of the Bay of Naples, close to where Paget lived, were where the Sibyl's cave could be found. The fields certainly have a hellish atmosphere, being situated on top of a collapsed magma chamber of an active volcano. The land is barren and hot, with fire and sulphurous gases leaking from the ground. It was near to here, where the fields vanish beneath the sea, that Paget and a small team of volunteers over the course of a decade excavated what turned out to be an incredible tunnel system. Almost immediately, it was obvious to Paget that the tunnels must have had some sort of ceremonial use. Their design was unnecessarily complex for a solely practical purpose. Notches for oil lamps occurred every yard in the tunnel's lower levels, far more frequently than would have been required merely to provide illumination. The orientation of the mysterious passageway which marked the entrance to the tunnel system also matched that of the midsummer solstice. Mysteriously, in the deepest and darkest part of the tunnel system, an underground stream, heated almost to boiling point in places, was discovered. With a sulphurous cloud hanging over its hot waters, the stream was reminiscent of classical descriptions of the river Styx. Continuing across the stream, through the heavy and reeking sulphurous air, Paget and his team found a steep ascending passage which opened into an antechamber. This room was described as a hidden sanctum by Paget. From there, further passageways with hidden staircases led off. Throughout the entire system, passageways had been blocked with rubble and rocks, making it difficult to appreciate fully the extent of the tunnels. All in all, the tunnels at Bayer were found to be immensely complex, with questions as to their purpose and full scope still unanswered. What was the hot, sulphurous stream discovered by Paget under the ground? And why were there tunnels leading to and from it? Had he, as he claimed, discovered the Sibyl's entrance to the underworld? For decades, there has been an ongoing mystery in the county of Suffolk, England. The enigma centres on a house in the area of Rougham, a house which, despite many claiming to have seen it, does not actually exist. One of the earliest recorded accounts of someone seeing this vanishing house was in 1926. Around this time, Ruth Wynne was tutoring Evelyn Allington, and they would customarily take walks in the afternoon together after their lessons. In October of 1926, they made a trip to the nearby church. Along the way, they claimed to have seen a high wall of greenish-yellow bricks. When the pair followed this wall around a corner, they encountered tall wrought-iron gates set in the wall. Beyond the gates, there was a driveway set among tall trees, which led to a large house with a stucco frontage that bore windows of Georgian design. The two ladies thought it odd that they had not yet met the owners of such a grand manor, but as they took a different route on their way back, they did not have any reason to question the experience as anything other than ordinary. The following spring, the two of them took the same route. However, where they had seen the house before lay only a wilderness of tumbled earth, weeds, mounds, all overgrown with the trees they had seen on their first visit. Struck by the strangeness of the missing house, Ruth wrote down their experience and submitted it to BBC Radio, which had a programme that dealt with supernatural topics. Their walk had only been 1.5 miles long, with no houses similar to the one they had described for many miles. And as they had arrived at the church as they had planned both times, they were certain the route had been the same on both occasions. Even so, when others heard their story, their tone was generally dismissive. At the time, it was thought that the ladies had merely been lost when they saw the house, with the route they took on their second walk different from the first. The testimony of Ruth Wynne may be the earliest recorded experience concerning Rougham's vanishing house. Yet, if an article featured in the gardening magazine Amateur Gardening in December 1975 can be believed, then there may be a longer tradition. A local resident in the area, writing under the pen name James Cobbold, stated that he had first heard mention of the house from a local little girl of around his own age in about 1911 or 1912. At the time, he had laughed at her, but when he mentioned the girl's story to his grandmother, she supposedly told him that when she was a young unmarried woman, her father had claimed to have seen the very same house. Placing the date at around 1860, the author of the article explained how his great-grandfather Robert Palfrey had been thatching a haystack in June when all of a sudden he noticed a house on the other side of the narrow lane. Palfrey, a local man, was described as having known those parts like the palm of his hand and did not recognize the house. He was puzzled and not a little scared, claiming that it had not been there 10 minutes earlier. According to the grandmother's story, he described the building in great detail, explaining that it had been made of a solid red brick, with 2 entrances, a quite small one and a somewhat larger one. Both had ornamental iron gates which were closed. The property was also described as having a beautiful garden, with roses and flower beds in full bloom. When Palfrey returned later that evening with his family in order to show them the peculiar house, it was gone. Shortly after hearing this account from his grandmother, Goddard wrote that he, too, experienced the vanishing house. At the time of writing, he claimed that encounters with the house were still discussed, with a young man from the village only a few weeks before relating to him how his father had seen the same thing happening at least twice during the past 10 years. And certainly these are not the only testimonies to have been shared regarding the house. Edward Bentley, a local worker, claimed to have seen the house vanish in the 1940s. Sandra Harwick and a local postwoman supposedly saw it around 1976. A retired couple, Jean and Sidney Battram, alleged to have seen it in 2007. Carl Grove, someone who has done extensive research into the Rougham case, has stated that almost everybody from Rougham knows someone who has seen the house. Many have researched this case in an attempt to find out if there ever was such a house in the location described by witnesses. Perhaps all these people had experienced time slips and had caught a glimpse of a now long gone structure. Patching together the testimonies, it is believed that the witnesses all saw the house in the vicinity of a patch of woodland called Colville's Grove. And, intriguingly, from various pieces of evidence uncovered by different researchers, it does indeed seem that a great building once stood in the area. It is in and around Colville's Grove that several residents have in the past claimed to have dug up very good quality bricks, going on to use them for driveways, walls and other projects. A local historian, Phil Sage, has stated that there may have been a house in the area called King's Hall, but not much is known about it. Then there is an official government-produced map from 1837, where today there is nothing but trees in the grove. The map indicates a driveway leading to what appears to have been a grand house. Might this be the house which so many have claimed to have seen whilst passing through the area? Whilst Rougham's disappearing house does appear to be a very convincing case, there are discrepancies in the descriptions given by many eyewitnesses that cannot be ignored. Some state that the house is red brick, others that it is coated in a fine plaster. It may, of course, be the case that people have slipped through time to see the property at various points in its history, and as such are describing it slightly differently. As only a handful of testimonies have been detailed enough to enable further investigation, more research is undoubtedly required. Perhaps most strange of all, however, is that the disappearing house of Rougham is not the only such case in the area. Whilst this case may have the most witnesses, there are reports of other vanishing houses in towns nearby. Also, considering that Rougham is a mere half an hour's drive from Kersey, a location known for its own remarkable time-slip case, it may very well be that Suffolk is a hotbed for time-slip phenomena. Bill Brooks is a former British Army soldier who was born in 1950. For 2/3 of his life, he did not believe in aliens, UFOs, or anything paranormal. All this changed at the age of 44. It was then that Brooks experienced what he has described as a sudden download of memories. memories which, until that point, he had supposedly suppressed and kept hidden deep within his subconscious mind. At first, it was one memory in particular which anchored firmly within his mind. Over the next 20 years, others would gradually resurface, until Brooks was left in no doubt that on several occasions over the course of his life, he had been abducted by aliens. After experiencing a series of heart attacks and strokes in the course of a single week in 2012, Brooks was left with the pressing need to share his experiences with others. It was his belief that it was important for humanity to understand what he had experienced. This sentiment culminated in the publication of a book in 2016. In his book, Brooks alleges that his extraterrestrial experiences dated back to his childhood, and that even after his moment of awakening, when he realized his history of abductions at the age of 44, he continued to be abducted. At one point, he describes having watched the Earth getting smaller and smaller through a window on a spaceship during a childhood abduction. After this point, his awareness of the event became muddled, with Brooks suggesting that his memory may have been wiped by the aliens. Missing time and confusion in regards to the chronology of events feature throughout Brooks's testimonies. On another occasion, he describes having found himself sitting on a path in the pitch dark with no recollection of anything at all. His last memory was of being there several hours earlier. Such claims of missing time are common amongst others who claim to be alien abductees. Soon after graduating from army training, Brooks was posted overseas to a high-security nuclear regiment in Germany. One night, whilst trying to sleep on top of an armoured vehicle after a cancelled military exercise, Brooks and his friend Joe were supposedly disturbed by light and smoke. The smoke was said to be similar to that of a flare, with the lights being almost blindingly bright and white. The scene which he claims to have watched unfold thereafter made absolutely no sense to Brooks whatsoever. He describes how he and Joe watched in disbelief as their fellow soldiers, as if under orders, began leaving the vehicles they'd been sleeping soundly in. Appearing to be in a trance, the men moved en masse towards some object with very bright lights in the field. Brooks points out that despite being exhausted from a long day of exercise, the men moved in perfect unison. Climbing down from the top of the vehicle in an attempt to investigate, Brooks was then supposedly confronted by a man dressed in black coveralls. He was armed and forcefully instructed Brooks to walk towards the light. In the end, both Brooks and Joe were made to do as the man commanded. Once again, Brooks claims that his memory of what followed is murky. The next morning, he and Joe found themselves standing on parade with no recollection of the night before, or indeed how they got on parade. Whilst Brooks affirms that he has no memory of what happened that night after being confronted by the man in black, he was left wondering whether he and his fellow soldiers had been part of a mass abduction. Brooks's book is packed with similarly sensational stories. As well as discussing his alleged abduction experiences, he also describes how he had to have 2 implants removed from his body after an abduction. Understandably, Brooks's accounts are difficult to digest, with Brooks himself acknowledging the incredible nature of his experiences. All that said, he is far from alone in his claims. Reports of alien abductions, whilst rare, do exist, and have been surprisingly well documented by various researchers. Ultimately, Brooks has stated that he can only share his story and let others decide what to think of it. When asked if he believes extraterrestrials pose a threat to mankind during an interview, he stated, "I haven't got the foggiest idea in reality, but why all the secrecy?" Could it be that this British soldier experienced a lifetime of abductions, including during active military service? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this and have not done so already, I invite you to subscribe for more of the paranormal. To never miss an upload, be sure to turn on all notifications by clicking the bell icon next to my subscription box. To watch the featured videos in full, you may find the corresponding links in the description. Equally, I encourage you to watch last year's compilation, the link to which is on screen now. Until next time.